The question that pulses beneath this story is simple yet profound. How did Solomon, a king of ancient Israel, become not only a legendary wise ruler but a spiritual architect whose influence reaches into occult traditions, manifestation teachings, and the secret laws of the unseen world? And more urgently, what is the cost when divine wisdom is tangled with New Age power, when spiritual authority drifts into forbidden realms, when the very keys of Solomon become both torch and trap? In the silent beginning, before any books bore his name, Solomon's life was defined by a humble devotion that few kings ever knew. As a young leader, he did not clamour for wealth, armies, or grand monuments. He asked for one thing: wisdom to govern justly, to judge rightly, to discern the true from the false. That prayer marked the turning point of his destiny. In answer, a mantle of supernatural insight descended upon him, not the insight of mere scholarship, but the kind that penetrates the spiritual architecture of creation, the hidden patterns behind nature, the spiritual forces that shape reality. This was no ordinary gift. It was a permission to see what others cannot. He perceived spiritual structures, hierarchies of beings, invisible authorities, and principles that bind the seen and the unseen. He grasped laws that do not appear in the marketplace, but in creation itself: the power of words, the flow of authority, the alignment of the heart. He understood that life is not only physical but governed by metaphysical design. From that height, Solomon built a kingdom whose brilliance was not only architectural but spiritual, a kingdom that echoed heaven's own order. But wisdom of such magnitude draws attention. It attracts seekers, mystics, and those hungry for power. Over time, Solomon's reputation grew beyond the courts of Israel. His name traveled across deserts, seas, and centuries. Scholars, magicians, occultists, and even manifestation teachers claimed connection to him. They whispered of secret keys, sigils, seals, spirit names, and hidden rituals that granted mastery over the spiritual realm. Some said he commanded demons. Others claimed he unlocked the secret names of God. Still others believed his wisdom laid the foundation for modern techniques of manifestation, visualization, and magical thinking. This intersection between biblical authority and esoteric tradition is where this documentary stands. We are not simply retelling legends. We are probing a deeper truth. What if the real keys of Solomon were not magical texts but spiritual laws? What if the power he possessed flowed not from mythic grimoires but from alignment with the divine order? And what if, as the video proposes, there is a spiritual danger when these laws are divorced from devotion? To answer this, we begin by examining the foundation of Solomon's wisdom, as recorded in ancient scripture, and then we trace how that foundation was reinterpreted, mythologized, and sometimes distorted in occult traditions. We will weigh biblical testimony, historical echoes, and modern spiritual movements, and we will confront a crucial tension. The tension between power and obedience, revelation and responsibility, divine calling and occult temptation. Let us walk step by step through this journey. First, we establish Solomon's spiritual foundation: a heart humble enough to ask, a soul trained to listen, and a king given great wisdom. Then we will build upward, exploring how that wisdom translated into authority, how later generations ascribed keys to him, and how modern seekers wrestle with the same spiritual laws he once embodied. In the quiet of ancient Jerusalem, young Solomon ascended the throne. He was not the firstborn, nor the greatest soldier. He was a man with a promise whispered to his father, and with a heart that trembled before God. The very early days of his reign were not marked by conquest, but by the seeking of counsel, by prayer, and by a deep fear of the Lord, that reverent fear which Scripture calls the beginning of wisdom. In that season of prayer, Solomon asked for understanding, not power for its own sake, not fame, not long life. He asked for the spiritual discernment to distinguish truth and falsehood, to govern God's people with justice. His request was not for selfish gain, it was for the ability to serve. And so God gave him more than he asked: wisdom and very great insight, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. From that moment, Solomon stood at a threshold between the mundane power of kings and a deeper spiritual authority. As his wisdom grew, Solomon began to see and interpret creation in a way that astonished his peers. He looked at nature, the trees, the animals, the heavens, and perceived spiritual signatures. He recognized patterns not only in behavior, but in the fabric of reality, how governing principles apply across the natural and supernatural. He understood that words carry power, that the tongue, when aligned with truth, can bind or release life, that authority is not merely about command, but about submission, that influence over the unseen comes through alignment with God's design. Solomon's judgments became legendary. His court was not just a royal court, it was a spiritual laboratory. He resolved disputes, not only from an intellectual vantage, but from a place of spiritual insight. His leadership was both political and metaphysical. He built alliances, yes, but he also built a model of discernment, the heart that hears heavenly instruction, the mind that reads divine order, the soul that governs with wisdom. He authored proverbs and penned reflections that capture his deep awareness of human nature, its vanity, its briefness, its paradox, its hunger, and its fragility. Yet with great insight came great exposure. People began to talk of Solomon in mystical terms. Traditions formed around his name, describing hidden books he wrote, spirit names he understood, seals he carried, rituals he performed. Over centuries, these traditions coalesced into what some now call the Keys of Solomon, texts attributed to him that claim to grant power over spirits, to unlock hidden names, to serve as a bridge between human will and spiritual realm. The occult interpretations are many, and they are compelling. Some say Solomon compiled 72 demons under his control. Others claim he inscribed magical sigils on his ring, granting him authority over angels and spirits. In some esoteric schools, his seal is used for invocation and manifestation. In modern manifestation circles, his wisdom is repackaged as law, the law of attraction, the law of authority, the law of creative word. But how much of this is authentic to Solomon, and how much is later embellishment or misinterpretation? That is the heart of our inquiry. We must ask, are these traditions simply myth-making around a great king, or do they hint at a lost spiritual architecture, a divine design that Solomon glimpsed fully and that subsequent generations distorted? To discern the truth, we examine biblical texts, examine later mystical writings, and listen to modern voices who claim they draw from Solomon's legacy. We also confront the danger, when spiritual power is divorced from worship, when manifestation becomes unmoored from obedience, when authority is claimed without humility. The video at the center of our exploration argues that Solomon's fall was not just political but spiritual, that the very authority he was granted became his trial. Silence falls here for a moment, because this tension is not theoretical. It is deeply real for anyone walking a spiritual path, for anyone seeking power, for anyone craving insight. When you pursue spiritual laws, when you aim to influence the unseen, you must ask yourself, am I serving God, or am I using his design? Am I stewarding wisdom, or am I manipulating spiritual forces? In this documentary, we do not aim to sensationalize. We aim to soberly examine. We aim to give weight to both biblical authority and spiritual reality. We will trace how Solomon's wisdom was received, repackaged, and reinterpreted across traditions. We will show that the keys attributed to him are not merely mystical trinkets, but in their origin, reflections of spiritual principles he truly understood. But we will also warn that those keys, when divorced from reverence and alignment, carry peril. Our journey is not just historical. It is spiritual, it is moral, it is practical. Because the same spiritual laws that Solomon seemed to master continue to operate today. The same principles of alignment, authority, and heart posture that shaped him are alive now in the world of manifestation, in the world of New Age practice, in the world of spiritual warfare. And each person who seeks power, who seeks wisdom, who seeks influence must face the same question. Will my foundation be built on devotion or on ambition? As we weave together ancient texts, mystical traditions, and modern testimonies, we will build a structure, a spiritual edifice, that reflects not only what Solomon may have known, but what we can learn from him. We will examine the foundation of his life, the walls of his wisdom, the roof of his legacy, and the lingering echoes of his influence across time. With the foundation laid in the early humility and divine favor of Solomon, we rise into the walls, the complex layered structures that represent not only his wisdom, but the exercise of authority in the visible and invisible realms. Here, we begin to see how insight transforms into influence, and how influence tests the character and heart of any who wield it. Solomon's life illustrates that spiritual wisdom and human authority are never separate. They are intertwined, and mastery over one requires integrity in the other. The walls of Solomon's reign were built with knowledge and judgment. Every decision he made, every law he enacted, every counsel he offered, reflected an understanding of the rhythms of human nature and the divine design that governs creation. In the marketplace, he observed the desires, fears, and ambitions of his people. In his courts, he discerned motives hidden beneath words. And in the secret chambers of his own soul, he recognized the dangers of pride, distraction, and divided attention. The scripture reminds that a discerning mind is rare, and that wisdom is not simply knowing, but applying knowledge with righteousness. These walls were also adorned with artistic, symbolic, and spiritual structures that elevated the ordinary to extraordinary. The palace, the temple, the chambers, every space carried intention. Every courtyard pattern and placement of sacred objects reflected heavenly principles, revealing that architecture itself can be a language of divine order. Even today, scholars study the geometric precision and proportionality of Solomon's temple as more than design. It is considered an allegorical map of spiritual truths. But the walls also carry tension. As Solomon's reputation spread beyond his own borders, the external pressures grew. Envoys and seekers from distant lands came bearing gifts, questions, and requests. Scholars, mystics, and magicians sought access to his knowledge. The fame that once served as validation began to whisper temptation. Those who encounter power often face the same question: will influence serve justice, or will it seduce? And Solomon, though wise, was human, walking the fine line between devotion and curiosity, between obedience and ambition. It was during this stage that the so-called keys emerge in historical and esoteric traditions. These are not keys of metal or engraved scripts, but principles and methods for influencing the unseen. In essence, they codify the laws Solomon understood intuitively: the authority of words, the alignment of intention, the hierarchy of spiritual influence. Later generations, interpreting these principles through mysticism, called them magical, even forbidden. In truth, they were applications of the same wisdom that had allowed a young king to judge nations and govern a people with equity. This is where caution enters the narrative. Solomon's mastery over spiritual and earthly realms exposed him to misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and misuse. Wisdom applied without obedience becomes fragile. Authority exercised without humility becomes a trap. Curiosity without reverence is dangerous. The walls of Solomon's kingdom were tall, but internal fissures began to appear, small cracks in the integrity of the heart that would not compromise his intellect, but would challenge his devotion. Despite this, the brilliance of his intellect and insight continued to illuminate the world around him. Disputes that seemed unsolvable were clarified through discernment. Conflicts between nations were mediated with justice, informed by spiritual insight. The natural world became a classroom, a mirror of heavenly order, and every creature, plant, and celestial movement was a text to be read. The walls, strong in their structure, conveyed not only protection, but instruction. They communicated that wisdom is not abstract, but practical, applied, and observable. Yet these walls also began to reflect tension between obedience and desire. Historical accounts suggest that Solomon's heart was gradually drawn toward alliances, practices, and influences that challenged the singular devotion which had formed his foundation. He welcomed voices, cultures, and ideas into his court, some of which tempted him towards spiritual compromise. The scripture repeatedly warns that the company we keep shapes our character, and a heart that is divided will eventually face decay, no matter how brilliant or powerful. It was in this period, as the walls reached their peak height, that the greatest lessons of the story became visible. Wisdom alone is insufficient if the heart drifts. Knowledge without application is fragile. Authority without humility is temporary. Power without alignment is perilous. Solomon understood the laws of creation and influence, but the human heart is subtle, capable of bending away from truth while still appearing faithful. This subtlety is the essence of spiritual testing, a lesson that transcends time, reaching into every era and every seeker who confronts unseen forces. The keys of Solomon thus serve as a metaphor as much as they do a literal interpretation. They represent the principle that access to power, spiritual, intellectual, or political, is governed by alignment with divine law. They are a reminder that mastery is not simply about technique, ritual, or memorization, but about posture of the heart. What distinguishes Solomon is not that he wielded power over spirits or forces, but that he possessed the discipline to respect the architecture of creation, to apply authority in harmony with divine instruction, and to see the unseen in its proper order. As the walls rise, the narrative tension becomes clear. Mastery is available, but it carries responsibility. Authority is granted, but it tests character. Knowledge is given, but it challenges humility. Every decision becomes a brick in the edifice of the life that will endure beyond the physical kingdom. Solomon's story illustrates that wisdom and obedience are inseparable, that insight without reverence is a risk, and that the measure of a person is revealed as much in restraint as in execution. During this time, he also engaged in the composition of wisdom literature, proverbs and reflections that codify his understanding of human behavior and spiritual law. These writings, often overlooked in their depth, reveal a profound sensitivity to the subtle forces shaping human experience. The cycles of success and failure, the vanity of material pursuit, the unseen consequences of speech, and the balance between instruction and action. They illuminate the walls of his life, providing insight not only into governance, but into the moral and spiritual architecture of existence. But the walls also carry shadows. Influence attracts envy, curiosity, and misinterpretation. As knowledge became legend, and as practices were transmitted and transformed by succeeding generations, a new narrative emerged. Mystics claimed mastery of spirits, scholars claimed access to hidden codes, and later traditions blurred the lines between divine wisdom and occult practice. These legends, while partially grounded in truth, demonstrate the human tendency to mythologize, to sensationalize, and to misappropriate knowledge. And herein lies a central lesson for our era. The same laws of influence and alignment that governed Solomon continue to operate today. Words carry weight. Authority follows alignment. Spiritual principle cannot be circumvented. Knowledge without reverence invites imbalance. The walls of Solomon's life, as well as the walls of our own existence, are only as strong as the integrity that binds each stone. By examining the walls of Solomon's life, we uncover a blueprint for stewardship, how to exercise insight, how to maintain balance under influence, how to govern responsibly in both seen and unseen realms, and how to navigate the tension between extraordinary opportunity and ordinary human temptation. These walls, tall and imposing, illustrate that mastery is accessible but not guaranteed, that wisdom is a gift but not a shield against human frailty, and that alignment with divine law is the anchor that preserves every structure, every life, every pursuit. The story of the walls, therefore, is a story of applied wisdom, tested authority, and measured insight. It is also a story of subtle compromise and the vigilance required to maintain alignment. Here we see the rise of influence, the exercise of judgment, and the first whispers of vulnerability that will become more pronounced as we reach the roof. The height of accomplishment, the exposure to pressure, and the ultimate test of the structure. At the roof of Solomon's life, all the walls he had built, wisdom, authority, influence, insight, met the ultimate test. The roof is the pinnacle, the place where vision stretches over the horizon, where oversight becomes responsibility, and where exposure to both glory and danger is complete. It is here that human character is most visible, where choices have their greatest consequence, and where the invisible forces of creation respond most clearly to the alignment or misalignment of the heart. From this height Solomon surveyed his kingdom. The splendor of the palace, the precision of the temple, the order of the courts, all reflected his genius. Yet he could see beyond the material. He observed the subtleties of human ambition, the currents of desire and envy, and the invisible patterns that govern both nations and hearts. He understood that mastery is not merely the exercise of power, but the stewardship of influence. Every decision he made at this level had consequences that reverberated far beyond what the eye could see. The roof is also where temptation grows strongest. With access comes exposure, and with exposure comes testing. Solomon's wisdom, now renowned across lands, attracted the attention of those who sought influence for selfish gain. Envoys and emissaries bearing both gifts and counsel entered his court. Alliances were proposed, marriages arranged, and promises whispered. Some offered insight, others offered distraction. Here, at the height of his authority, the tension between obedience and desire became tangible. The scripture warns that the heart that turns aside even slightly can shift the balance of a lifetime, and so the king stood at the apex, both elevated and vulnerable. It is said that the keys of Solomon emerge most dramatically at this stage. These are not mere physical objects, but the principles that govern influence over spiritual and natural laws. Some interpretations claim they give control over spirits. Others insist they unlock hidden wisdom. Still others see them as a manual for manifestation and creative authority. But at the roof we see the truth. The keys are effective only in alignment. A man may possess insight, but without reverence, without submission, without humility, the keys become mirrors of ambition rather than instruments of divine design. Solomon began to sense the subtle shifts in his own heart. The devotion that had once guided him was being tested by the pleasures of wealth, the allure of influence, and the enticement of counsel that did not align with divine instruction. These were not overt acts of rebellion, but incremental deviations, soft distractions that accumulate over time. The scripture cautions that a divided heart cannot endure, and here on the roof, where decisions could shape entire generations, the cost of divided attention was most evident. Even at this apex, Solomon's intellect remained profound. His judgment continued to astound. Conflicts were mediated with precision. Laws were established with foresight. The kingdom flourished. Yet the roof exposes the tension between mastery and morality. The higher one ascends, the more apparent the fractures become. Power illuminates character as sharply as it amplifies influence. Those who ascend without integrity risk seeing their brilliance become their undoing. At the same time, the roof phase reveals a remarkable truth. The extraordinary access Solomon enjoyed, both to insight and spiritual authority, was never purely for self-glory. It was stewardship. Every law applied, every court decision made, every principle invoked was a reflection of divine order. The wisdom he wielded was a tool for alignment with creation's principles. And it is here that modern interpretation often misfires, claiming that Solomon's keys granted selfish mastery. In reality, the spiritual laws he understood are instruments of balance, not control. They require the operator to be aligned, disciplined, and obedient. Without that, the roof becomes a dangerous vantage. The metaphor of the roof also reflects vulnerability. Just as a physical roof shields from the storm but can collapse if its beams weaken, spiritual and moral roofs are tested by exposure. Solomon's exposure came not only from external temptation but from internal desire. His heart was measured against divine standards. The scripture repeatedly warns that pride precedes a fall, and that power without humility invites judgment. The higher one climbs, the greater the scrutiny, both from visible observers and invisible forces. In this stage, the narrative tension peaks. Solomon's wisdom could build empires, shape nations, and influence the spiritual currents around him. Yet even his genius could not insulate him from the subtle erosion of alignment. Here is a lesson for every seeker. Mastery amplifies character. The more gifted a person, the more precise the discipline must be. The roof exposes what walls and foundations may conceal. It reveals where obedience has faltered, where devotion has weakened, and where insight is divorced from practice. From the roof, Solomon also observed the consequences of misalignment, not only in himself but in the world. He saw how a small shift in the heart can ripple outward, affecting people, nations, and generations. Wisdom, when not paired with reverence, can be interpreted as authority without conscience. Influence, when divorced from obedience, can become manipulation. Knowledge, without discipline, can transform into pride. The roof of his life is therefore both a vantage and a warning. The higher the view, the more transparent the soul. Even so, Solomon's reflections from the roof were not despairing. They were sober, measured, and instructional. He began to codify lessons in Proverbs, reflections, and Psalms that would outlast his physical reign. These texts emphasize alignment, the weight of speech, the power of discernment, the danger of divided affections, and the importance of humility. They became the enduring beams supporting the spiritual roofs of countless generations. Here, too, the symbolic keys take on their deepest meaning. They are no longer seen as tools of external domination, but as principles of spiritual order. Authority follows alignment. Words carry life or death. Influence demands responsibility. Knowledge requires obedience. These principles, when misapplied, become instruments of deception or ambition. When understood and honored, they become instruments of stewardship and blessing. The roof phase illuminates this duality vividly. From this vantage, the story also reveals a paradox. Solomon's greatest power was inseparable from his greatest vulnerability. The very laws that allowed him to influence the unseen also exposed him to temptation. The same insight that brought prosperity also revealed the fragility of human devotion. The roof is therefore both triumph and test. It is the moment when every decision, every lapse, and every alignment becomes visible to the eyes of eternity. This stage of his life is where many myths exaggerate, dramatize, or distort. Later traditions describe magical books, engraved seals, spirit names, and mystical rituals. Modern interpretation often conflates these embellishments with the reality of spiritual law. But at the height of Solomon's reign, the true keys were not objects. They were practices, principles, and postures of the heart. They were the invisible architecture of authority, discernment, and alignment, understood by few and respected by fewer. The roof phase teaches an enduring truth. Wisdom and power demand vigilance. Authority requires humility. Insight must be paired with obedience. Knowledge without alignment invites subtle ruin. These lessons transcend history, speaking directly to anyone seeking mastery, influence, or spiritual insight. Solomon's life demonstrates that the higher the ascent, the sharper the test, and the more essential the alignment with divine order. As the sun sets on the roof, there is both reflection and instruction. Solomon sees the kingdom thriving, his structures standing, his wisdom recorded, and yet he understands that the true measure of his life is not in walls or splendor, but in the integrity of heart. He perceives the fleeting nature of human admiration, the transience of material achievement, and the eternal weight of spiritual alignment. He recognizes that the lessons of the roof will endure far beyond him, guiding generations in understanding the balance of wisdom, authority, and reverence. The roof is therefore a metaphor for culmination, a place of oversight, exposure, triumph, and responsibility. Here, the highest truths are visible, alignment preserves power, obedience ensures wisdom, and humility safeguards the heart. It is at this height that Solomon's story becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the challenges of the ancient king, but the ongoing human struggle with knowledge, influence, and the unseen laws of creation. From the roof, the story naturally moves toward conclusion, not merely of life or reign, but of understanding. Every beam, every wall, every foundation laid from the earliest days to the apex carries a lesson. That extraordinary wisdom, when paired with discipline and reverence, can bless nations. That misalignment, even subtle, can erode the strongest structures, and that the principles behind Solomon's keys, spiritual, ethical, and practical, remain operational today. As we descend from the roof and survey the entirety of Solomon's life, we begin to see the full architecture of wisdom in its proper order. Every foundation, every wall, every beam and pinnacle was a lesson in alignment, obedience, and the stewardship of knowledge. The final stage, the legacy, is not measured in monuments, gold, or renown, but in the principles that endure through time, resonating in the hearts and minds of generations who seek wisdom, influence, and spiritual insight. Solomon's life demonstrates that every structure, no matter how grand, is sustained not merely by skill or intellect, but by the alignment of the builder's heart. Foundations of humility, fear of the Lord, and the pursuit of understanding are essential. The walls, applied wisdom, discernment, and authority, are strong only when supported by that foundation. And the roof, the pinnacle of achievement and influence, tests the integrity of everything beneath it. When alignment falters at the top, the entire structure is at risk. The legacy of Solomon's wisdom is both cautionary and aspirational. On one hand, it warns of the fragility of human devotion when confronted with power, fame, and temptation. The roof of his life, although elevated and radiant, was a place of exposure, revealing subtle drift in the heart, the danger of divided attention, and the consequences of even small deviations from obedience. The scripture reminds that those who trust in their own understanding without honoring divine principle invite instability, no matter how brilliant their intellect. On the other hand, his life offers a blueprint for anyone seeking mastery in any domain. The principles behind the so-called keys, alignment, authority, discernment, the power of words, the hierarchy of influence, and the integrity of intention remain operative today. They are not mystical shortcuts or magical incantations. They are timeless laws governing human behavior, spiritual interaction, and the exercise of influence. When applied correctly, they allow one to navigate complex challenges, discern hidden truths, and steward both personal power and the responsibilities it entails. The enduring lesson is that wisdom is inseparable from humility, and authority is inseparable from responsibility. Knowledge amplifies character, it magnifies devotion or exposes pride. Influence does not create virtue, it reveals it. Solomon's writings, proverbs, and reflections codify these truths in a form accessible to any seeker. The use of words, the alignment of intention, the observance of ethical and spiritual principle, and the acknowledgement that unseen forces respond to moral posture as much as to intellect or ritual. The legacy also challenges modern interpretations that overemphasize mysticism while neglecting morality. Many who claim access to the keys of Solomon treat them as tools for control or personal gain. Yet the core teaching embedded in his life is profoundly ethical and spiritual. Power must be exercised in reverence, wisdom must be paired with obedience, and every insight must serve alignment with divine order. Without this balance, the application of knowledge becomes vanity, and influence becomes a shadow of its intended purpose. As the reflection deepens, the story of Solomon becomes a mirror for our own lives. The structures we build, our families, careers, relationships, and personal disciplines, are like the foundations, walls, and roofs of a great edifice. The same principles operate in microcosm. Humility and pursuit of understanding lay the foundation, the exercise of wisdom and ethical judgment form the walls, and the pinnacle of influence, achievement, and authority constitutes the roof. Every deviation in heart or intention risks the stability of the structure. Every alignment strengthens it. This is why the teaching of the keys resonates beyond legend or occult tradition. It is not the objects themselves that matter, but the principles they represent. Understanding unseen order, exercising discernment, using words and intention responsibly, cultivating alignment with higher truths, and recognizing that authority carries accountability. These lessons are universal. They extend beyond ancient Israel, beyond kings and prophets, beyond mystical texts. They apply to any person, in any generation, who seeks to navigate the complexities of life, influence, and spiritual principle. Solomon's life also demonstrates the cyclical nature of human endeavor. Foundations established with care can be undermined if devotion falters. Walls built with wisdom can be compromised by subtle misalignment. Roofs of achievement can expose flaws in character. Yet when these elements are harmonized, the structure not only stands, it endures, inspiring generations, shaping culture, and transmitting principles that outlast lifetimes. His writings, his legacy, and the stories that grew around him all carry this rhythm: rise, test, alignment, and enduring insight. Even the legends, the myths, and the embellishments serve a purpose. They draw attention to the reality of invisible order. They teach that extraordinary wisdom will always attract attention, curiosity, and ambition, and that the spiritual and moral laws underpinning influence cannot be ignored. Solomon's life and the interpretations it inspired reveal that the pursuit of mastery is never purely intellectual. It is ethical, spiritual, and deeply practical. It is a daily choice to align knowledge with principle, insight with reverence, and authority with accountability. We conclude then with the synthesis of the four elements: foundation, walls, roof, and legacy. The foundation is humility and pursuit of wisdom. The walls are applied insight, discernment, and ethical exercise of authority. The roof is the pinnacle of influence, achievement, and spiritual testing. The legacy is the enduring principle that governs the structure long after the king has passed, guiding every seeker in their own construction of life and character. To the viewer, the story is not merely historical. It is functional, practical, and profoundly instructive. It invites reflection on the alignment of heart, the application of knowledge, the exercise of influence, and the responsibilities that accompany power. It demonstrates that extraordinary insight, whether inherited, discovered, or cultivated, is only as enduring as the obedience and humility that accompany it. Finally, the story returns to the guiding question: what makes the keys of Solomon truly powerful? The answer is revealed in the architecture of his life: alignment with divine order, the disciplined exercise of wisdom, reverence in action, and the integration of insight with moral responsibility. They are keys not to control, but to stewardship, not to manipulation, but to understanding, not to personal gain, but to the elevation of human and spiritual potential. Solomon's life is a cautionary tale and a blueprint, a parable of power and devotion. It is a reminder that knowledge, authority, and influence are instruments that magnify whatever resides in the heart. It is a call to those who seek mastery: build your foundation with humility, erect your walls with wisdom, reach your roof with discernment, and leave a legacy that reflects alignment, integrity, and reverence. In the final reflection, we see that the secrets, the wisdom, and the keys are never about the king, the ring, or the rituals. They are about the timeless principles that govern the unseen, the moral laws that sustain influence, and the alignment necessary for lasting wisdom. They are as alive today as they were in Solomon's time, waiting for those who seek not just knowledge but understanding, not just power but responsibility, not just insight but obedience. And so the story closes not with legend but with instruction. The architecture of life, authority, and wisdom requires careful construction, constant vigilance, and humble alignment. Every foundation must be tested, every wall must be inspected, every roof must endure. The keys are not objects, they are principles. And those who understand them, align with them, and honor them will build structures that endure beyond their time, shining with the light of wisdom, justice, and spiritual insight for generations to come. In the end, the story returns to where it began, not at the throne, nor the temple, nor the vaults where legends claim hidden keys were stored, but at the simple truth that shaped everything Solomon ever touched. Wisdom was never an object to possess, it was a posture to maintain. The greatest mystery was never locked behind stone walls or sealed in ancient manuscripts. It was written into the human heart, available to anyone willing to listen, to observe, to seek understanding with humility rather than hunger for domination. The deeper you travel into the life of Solomon, the more the noise of myth falls away, until all that remains is a quiet echo of something profoundly human. A man blessed with extraordinary insight, gifted with a mind that could read patterns in nature and patterns in people, yet still vulnerable to the drift that reaches every soul when attention splits and devotion weakens. His rise teaches the potential of alignment. His decline teaches the cost of forgetting it. Together they form a complete lesson, one powerful enough to shape entire civilizations. And as time moves forward, generations continue to search for the secrets he carried, like hoping the answers lie in artifacts, symbols, or rituals. But the real key remains the same as it was in his earliest days. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and understanding grows only where humility is rooted deeply enough to sustain it. That is the doorway. That is the true access. Every other key is an echo of that alignment. When the stones of the temple finally cooled, when the throne that once gleamed with gold stood silent, and when the people who once sought judgment at his feet scattered into history, only one thing endured: the principles he carved into the world through word, decision, and devotion. Principles that continue to outlive kings, manuscripts, and legends. Principles that stand unshaken by time. And so the story does not end with Solomon. It ends with the listener. The one who hears these words and understands that wisdom is not inherited, it is chosen. Influence is not an accident, it is cultivated. Authority is not magic, it is responsibility. And every seeker, whether king or commoner, must decide what foundation they will build on, what walls they will raise, and what roof they will stand beneath when the winds begin to test the structure of their life. If Solomon's story teaches anything, it is that the greatest secrets are not hidden, they are merely ignored. The greatest keys are not mystical, they are deeply practical. And the greatest power lies not in commanding the unseen, but in aligning with the one who governs it. This is where the journey ends. Not with a crown, not with a ring, not with a vault of forbidden knowledge, but with a simple, unchanging truth. Wisdom is a path, not a possession. And for those who walk it with humility, clarity, and obedience, the same God who guided Solomon will guide them also.